From the archives of the great library of Arathes, golden city of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, arch-preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Phillip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 2. After a twisted and dizzying ride down through the Byzantine streets of Arathes, Fraenk and Nim slowed their palfreys on the vast avenue that looked out to the harbour of Lake Ewan. They halted some distance back from the gated entrance of the market. They could see the large iron gate was open, cracked just wide enough to admit a man. Just as they stopped, 3 dirt-covered dwarves rolled a rumbling cart full of scrap metal past, speaking low in their guttural cadence of the mountain tongue. When they noticed the 2 preceptors, one uttered some mockery that made the others snicker and wheeze. They continued on, shouldering the cart into noisy, rattling motion down the road. "My dwarvish is rusty, but I think he said something about our delicate skin would crack under the weight of their lips," Nim said, glaring as they left. "Do they think we're women?" Of a sort, come on. You can pick a fight with those troll spawn later," Fraenk said, dismounting his horse. The Lower Market Bazaar of Blackroot district lacked both the upscale offerings and high-end clientele that the Grand Market of Arathes in Hardoak district had, but in terms of the variety of goods from across the world, it was second to none. During the day, it was home to hundreds of stalls that commenced brisk commerce, voices ringing out in a babble of languages. Both elven kind and humans alike came to barter for Gazian hot spices, skeins of rough woolen yak yarn from Vigabrock, dragon-fired crystal dishware from distant show, aromatic tobacco, beer by the barrel, white-stringed camlin lyres, dark Tigrinian cutlery and ripe aromatic fruits from Ophidaran Isles, all on offer. Not to mention countless other goods that weren't strictly legal. It seemed to be one of the few places where both elves and humans met on equal terms, without an air of pretense, family, or station. The bazaar was nestled in a wide stone courtyard, hemmed in on 3 sides by tall buildings, where the merchants and their families lived and carried out business. In the centre was pressed with an assemblage of canvas stalls for the transient vendors. Those with imported goods fresh from the docks had to be carted in every morning and out every night. The gate was locked at the night bell, but traders knew it was far from secure. "Tie up the horses," Fraenk said, handing his reins to his underling. "I'll cock an ear to the whispers." Nim had no sooner lashed the pair to one of the potted palm trees that lined the avenue when a scream came from overhead. Nim looked up, startled. Then a pair of feuding, or perhaps coupling, scrates tumbled noisily from the fronds. They twisted mid-air, landing lightly feet first on the stones, nearly hitting Stonebridge. "Ulf's hammer!" Nim cursed, stumbling backward, away from their nasty claws and mildly poisonous saliva. Its yellow eyes narrowed and seemed ready to charge him until he kicked at it, making it shy back. The larger scrate immediately scrambled across the courtyard, wedging its body into an open drainage pipe. The other gave its scaly skin a few irritated licks, then hissed at them both before clambering up the wall and onto the roof. They listened to its claws clicking delicately on the clay tiles. Nim looked back to see Fraenk standing near the alley across the thoroughfare. A cluster of filthy street kids in ragged garments gathered around him, and he was speaking in an urgent tone with them. All had patchy, close-cropped hair which made it hard to determine their gender. They were stick-thin and probably crawling with lice and fleas. The residents of the city rarely, if ever, spoke to these kids, except to clout them away when they begged for a spare copper coin, or suspiciously sidled too close to an unguarded trader's cart. To the criminal element of the city, street kids were seen as a nuisance on a level with the scrates, pickpockets and barrel bandits who were too small to take anything important, but an annoyance nonetheless. Nim watched with curiosity as Fraenk spoke to them like he would another citizen. They gestured. Fraenk nodded. He asked something and they pointed. And when they concluded their business, Nim heard the distinctive clink as Fraenk dropped a trio of copper coins into the tallest boy's hands. The kids quickly scampered off down the street, the youngest among them calling out with delighted yips. After Fraenk returned back, Nim waited for an explanation, and when none was forthcoming, he asked, "Getting a line on the best begging corners, sir? How do you think I stay so well informed? There's none who sees more than the alley rats. Ah, so it was them that sent you the cipher. Just so. It's important to know these things as a preceptor, and to keep your informants eager to share. Fraenk proceeded up to the market gates, where a loose gathering of humans and a pair of curious furbogs stopped to peer through the bars and whisper rumours to one another. Seeing the preceptors, the conversation stopped entirely until after Fraenk and Nim slipped inside. Fraenk pulled the gate shut behind them. The rats said there's 2 partisans already in there, but they raised the summoning call and more are likely on the way. We need to go quickly. They say what happened? Nim asked. Nothing good. As they strode quickly past the long list of canvas stalls and shuttered shops, Fraenk felt a dark weight begin to creep into his gut. This was no place for real trouble, least of all in the early hours of the morning. There had always been the heated, almost athletic bartering over overpriced goods, which did sometimes devolve into verbose curses involving impossible violations of the bodily orifices of close family members. Haggling for an immaculately struck bargain was, in fact, one of the lower market's charms. This spirited deal-making rarely came to blows, however. There was even the random scuffle over an allegedly rigged scale or counterfeit good, even a hard cuff to a would-be pickpocket or alley rat, and any true criminal in the market getting a definitive beating by the merciless partisans assigned to its security. Now walking past these closed and darkened stalls felt like a midnight stroll through a mausoleum. It was all dark shadows and blind corners. Fraenk looked back to make sure Nim was still behind him. He spied the half-elf a few booths back, having paused to admire the lurid painting on a shop canvas that sold women's erotic night garments. Fraenk whistled softly through his teeth to get Nim's attention. When he had caught up, Fraenk indicated back over his shoulder with a tilt of the head. The flickering glow of orange light bounced off the facades of the building just around the corner. Sorry, sir. I was just... Never mind that. Follow me and don't let these partisans tell us our business, Fraenk said. Nim set his lip and gave a single determined nod. Fraenk was surprised by a feeling of strength with having the half-elf at his side. He returned the nod and they strode forth. They rounded past a stall with tall draping silks slung on bamboo poles, and the far corner of the plaza came into view, and there ahead of them was the bakery.
The boy crouched on his heels in the alley, angry and waiting. The deep gash on his chin had finally stopped bleeding. Dried blood on his neck cracked and flaked to the ground. The throb of pain in his chin that pulsed with each heartbeat was a distant noise. His small fist gripped the broken sword tang with a partial blade that he'd stolen from the blacksmith shop's scrap pile. Despite being pitted and rusty, it still held an edge sharp enough to cleave flesh. The boy was trembling now from adrenaline and rage. He realized he was crying and tried to palm away the tears, only to get a fresh burst of pain from the swollen, bruised eye where they had punched and kicked him repeatedly. It only made him angrier. He leaned forward and peered out the alley again. He caught sight of the older group of boys up the street coming towards him. The ringleader, a thick-bodied brute named Mudge, had just made some joke that made all except one of them cackle with laughter. The butt of the joke lashed out, and the lackeys scrapped and jostled for a moment until their leader ordered it to stop. Even though he was probably only a year or 2 older than the young boy, Mudge was somehow a foot taller and 2 stone heavier. He had a bovine frame and doughy gut that made him impossible to beat in a fight by himself, let alone with the entire gang raining blows down. And as skinny and malnourished as the boy was, the fight was over almost as soon as it started. He woke up hours later in a hog's pen, his body in agony as he'd never experienced before. That night, as he shivered under the only tattered blanket they'd left him, he made a dark vow to himself. And in the morning, when he trusted his legs to carry him again, he retrieved the homemade dagger from its hiding spot. Now Mudge's reign of terror on the streets would end. Not just for him. The boy no longer cared what happened to himself. This was for all the other alley rats who the bully and his gang had preyed upon. No more beatings, no more thievery from those who had nothing to begin with, and none of the other violations that left street children vacant-eyed and withdrawn. This would be righteous, terrible justice for those who had no other recourse. He heard their voices getting louder. They were almost to him. The boy gripped the dagger tightly and hoped his aching body would hold up for just a bit longer. Just on the other side of the corner, Mudge's pubescent voice cracked as he tried to call his group's attention to something in the road. There was cruelty in his tone. The boy knew this would be his moment. He stood, fist clenched on the blade, and, "Say, lad, pardon. Could I ask a favour of you?" A man's voice came from behind. The boy was so focused he hadn't even heard him approach. Startled, the boy lost his footing as he spun around to see who had gotten the drop on him. The human man was tall and wide in the shoulders and the waist. His hair and beard were black and trimmed close to his head. He wore a white linen shirt with the sleeves removed and a heavy white apron tied around him like a tent. His entire body was dusted with a fine layer of flour. In the thick towel in his hands, he held a dark brown loaf of bread that steamed mightily, direct from the oven. The smell of it hit him immediately, rich, toasty, and sweet, and his knees wobbled under him. The boy recognized the man as the chief baker who operated the shop in whose alley he was currently skulking. The boy quickly slipped the broken knife behind his back to hide it. Adults could make a lot of trouble for a street kid if they suspected you were up to mischief, and this boy, covered in blood and filth, looked exactly as if he'd sworn to bring all hells and damnation on a quest for vengeance. But the baker raised an expectant eyebrow. "I'm very displeased, lad. I'll have you know that," he said, but his face didn't look troubled. The boy looked for an escape, but Mudge and his gang were just around the corner on the street, and this large baker was blocking his only exit through the alley. His brain worked feverishly, trying to decide which direction, if any, he might be able to go. His aching ribs and fatigued muscles told him to give up now and accept his fate. "Sir," was all he could manage to say. "Well, look at this bread," the baker said with displeasure, his brow creasing down now. "It's a disgrace. I blame myself, totally ruined. Why, I can't serve this to my customers. They'd toss me out of the city onto my ear. Tell me, lad, is this loaf ruined?" I couldn't say, the boy stammered. "Well, of course not, standing way over there and just looking at it. You got to taste it to know for true." A playful tone crept into the baker's voice, even though he still looked angry. His large hands tore open the loaf, letting an eruption of a hot steam out. The boy's mouth instantly began to water, and a low growl from his stomach seemed to echo in the alley. "Well, come on!" The baker held a chunk of bread towards him. The boy couldn't think anymore, his caution abandoned by his traitorous stomach. He staggered forward and grabbed off a small piece from the half loaf. It was in his mouth, and swallowed before he even realized it. "Ah, that's no good. You ate it so fast you didn't even taste it. Here, lad, you need a big piece, so you can tell me plain. Sit, lad, sit." The baker swept a hand towards a nearby crate. The boy did as he was asked, too hungry to resist. The baker placed the entire half-loaf in his waiting hands, and he immediately began trying to stuff the entire thing into his mouth. "Slow down, boy. You got to actually taste it. There. Now, what say you? How bad is it?" He forced himself to stop and just chew the large chunk that was already in his mouth. The baker raised an eyebrow expectantly. "It's terrible bread. Probably the worst I've had," the boy said finally and took another bite. "Ah, I knew as much," the baker replied in mock despair. He sat down on the crate beside the boy, which creaked under his weight. The boy was only halfway through the bread, but his shrunken stomach was already beginning to protest. He stopped and just felt the warmth in his hands. His aching ribs, swollen eye and cut chin, he didn't feel any of it. Just a glow of contentment he'd not known since. "Good thing I ran into you out here, lad," the baker said finally. "I could have made a bad mistake, one that I would have sorely regret." The boy turned to the sound of braying laughter on the street. Mudge and his gang were throwing rocks at a limping dog, chasing it down the street. He suddenly felt very foolish even thinking of taking on the brute. He would have been killed. "Well, I suppose you'll be wanting a bit of sweet buttermilk to wash down that horrible bread with. Eh, lad?" The boy couldn't speak. He only nodded and began to cry. The big baker stood and started back towards his shop. Then he turned. "My name's Myken, by the by. What do they call you?" The boy looked up and managed to squeak out one word. "Fraenk."
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.